so I don't forget to do that. And
Yeah.
hopefully the rest of our folks will be along shortly. Let me just mark who's on my naughty list, which would be none of you all, since you're all here. Ashley's just sneaking in. She's lucky she's at the bottom of the alphabet, or I would have put the L next to her name already. Um, L for late, not like the other kind of L. So, um, all right. Let me. So we're gonna, like I said, we're gonna go through lymphatic system today. I feel like we've covered pretty much what we needed to cover for the circulatory vessels. We'll review that a little bit for lab, just to try and get the names of them all nailed down a little bit better, so that you guys will be ready for the last lab quiz next week. Um, and really, we're pretty much right on track with where the syllabus says we should be. So I'm pretty happy with that, because this is a hard class for me to get through everything on. We've got 4 chapters left. After this one, we'll cover 2 of them next week, and then we have our last small test, and then we'll cover 2 more chapters, kind of in very short time, that last week of class, and then wrap everything up on the 20th. So let me admit all these people. Um, I still need to put together the lab practical final, and I'm originally I had hoped that we'd be on campus a little bit, and so we'd be using some potential models and things like that, but that's not going to happen. So really, what I'm going to do is just go through all the ones that we've done so far, um, based on those images from the cadaver dissection tool, and I'm just going to create a test from that. Um, in prior years, I've had 100 questions on that practical exam, so they're 1 point each. I'm not sure if I'll make it that long, because you guys are going to be having to do the written exam and the practical exam back to back in short succession. I know that's going to be a long testing day. Um, and so I'll kind of think about the logistics of that. I might let people that are get done early with the written test to go ahead and just jump into taking the practical exam. And others, if they want to take a little bit of a breather in between, then they could come back and start the lab exam. But I'll kind of figure out the details of that as we get a little bit closer.
I have a question.
Uh huh.
Would you have a practice exam like just worth no points, but it's just helps us practice for the main exam?
Um, I mean, I think as far as the lab practical exam, if you guys can go back into Connect and just view those individual ones that you've taken previously, I think that's probably as good a review as anything. And then I think you should also probably be able to review the first 5 written exams for the lecture component too. And so those are probably as helpful as anything to get some practice. I'm not sure that the answers for the written exams are visible anymore. I usually make them visible for a short period of time, so you can kind of check yourself after you finish. But I still think that questions and the potential answers are out there, so you can kind of check yourself, I guess, a little bit on those. I'll think about whether I want to make all the answers visible, because that obviously helps you if you go back and retest yourself on that information to know whether you were right or not. So without having to pour through and find the answer, to know which one it was, because that can take a lot longer. And I know you
I
guys.
also have another question.
Uh huh.
What would the essay part of the exam be like? Of
Um,
what would the question be? Would it be on structures of the body, or would it be on like how things work?
does the study guide say there's an essay?
What you said written part.
Written versus the lab. So the lecture portion of class versus the lab portion of class. Um, Written exam versus what we would normally call a practical exam, where it's more skills based. In this class, normally the practical exams would be on either, when we used to have cadavers, they'd be on the cadavers primarily and the specimens and things like that. So it was trying to kind of identify things in 3D on these actual images. The last couple of years, we've had to use models for all that. When we get into your later skills based classes, then the practical exams are assessing how good you are at measuring, joint range of motion, at assessing muscular strength, at performing balance tests and exercise interventions, knowing what's safe to do for different conditions, what we kind of need to be a little bit more careful about, and those kind of things. So when you hear the term written exam versus practical exam, usually the practical exam is going to be a more skills-based. With this class, it used to be, like I said, when we were on campus, it would be more models and things like that, as opposed to just flat picture images and drawings and things like that.
So, okay. So it'd be like, here's a dummy, find this certain thing, like the name of it, and point to it.
Usually what I will do is, for those types, I just have like the model, and I'll put stickers with numbers on them at a number of different locations. And then there'd be a question associated with the sticker. So you have to kind of see where the sticker is, read what the question's asking, and then figure out what the answer would be. But for you guys, it's just going to be very similar to what you've been doing for the lab quizzes with all the images from that cadaver dissection tool. I think just keeping it consistent with what you guys have been looking at will make it easier for you guys to kind of transfer that knowledge over and have more success with it. So. All right, let's get rolling. I see some people kind of popping in and out, maybe having some connection issues with all that.
Also, I have a question for Maddie. Why is your camera looking up so high and we just see you just at the bottom of the screen?
I don't know. I just push it away because my book's like in front of me. I don't know.
Important stuff. Her laptop's not tilted down as much, maybe.
Is that better?
No, you're still you're like doing the 1/3 picture thing, right? Your face is in the bottom third.
You're about here, which is fine.
Okay.
Sorry.
And Eric, if it's shifted the other way, you can just pretend she's got her mask on.
I don't know. I'm just being silly, but okay.
Maddie, I like seeing your artwork.
Thank you.
All right.
Also, tell me.
808. We gotta get rolling, Eric. So let's talk about the lymphatic system. So our lymphatic vessels are, unlike the circulatory system, they're a one-way system. So they don't have vessels carrying things away from the heart and then vessels returning things to the heart. It's really just returning things towards the heart and getting it back into the central circulation. So we don't carry stuff out in the lymphatic system. It's really more about just picking things up and bringing them back in. So the stuff that, in order to pick stuff up, we do need something to be out, to go out, that we have to reabsorb. And so what is coming out mostly is plasma that leaks out of the capillaries in the circulatory system. And so then the lymphatic vessels are going to assist the venous system in picking up that extra fluid. So they usually say about 85 to 90% of the plasma that leaks out of our capillaries, when we get down to the cellular tissue level of different structures, organs, muscles, things like that, gets picked up by the veins on the venous side of things. And that remaining 10 or 15% is what the lymphatic system normally will kind of pick up and kind of help reabsorb. So that lymph fluid does vary a little bit in where it's coming from in the body. The digestive system lymphatic fluid in particular is a lot different than what we would see in the arms and legs and some of the other body regions, just because it's also is helping absorb some of the nutrients from the gut. So it helps the capillaries with that. Specifically, the lymphatic system tied into the small intestine helps pick up fat. So the lymph there is kind of more milky looking because it has a lot of lipids in it, whereas it's not nearly the same. Most of our lymph has a lot of protein in it, and a lot of that protein occurs just as a product of like breaking down cells that are dying off, that the body is trying to rid itself. We have the macrophages that'll come in and start, and lysozymes and things like that will start destroying some of these structures to kind of recycle the parts. And so those little smaller broken down protein pieces leave the intact cells and basically are in that interstitial space. And so the lymphatic vessels are a big part of how we kind of get those things back into the circulation. And then most of the time, those are going to go back to the liver and probably get reprocessed a little bit and tweaked so that they can kind of become something else in the body. If we've got too much and we don't need them, then we're going to end up excreting them. So they're going to get into the bloodstream eventually, and then they'll go to the kidney, and then the kidney can get rid of some of those protein fragments. You can definitely have kidney issues if you overload the system with too much protein, and that creates a condition called rhabdomyolysis that we'll talk about in some later classes. It's kind of well known for occurring in people that do CrossFit that aren't really conditioned to do CrossFit, that they go in and they try and keep up with the people that have been doing that exercise routine for a long time, and it's such a high intensity, high impact kind of thing that they basically shred their muscles so much that first time or two, or if they ramp up the intensity, then they just basically have way too much protein in their circulation, and it starts clogging up the kidneys and prevent the kidneys from being able to kind of process the fluid and do their job. They've had instances, I think it was the University of Iowa, had a whole group of their football players. They had this rah-rah strength coach that brought them back from off season and put them through this major torture session, and like half a dozen of the guys end up in the hospital with acute kidney failure as a result of that. So that lymphatic system, it has ability to pick up those proteins, but it's limited in its capacity to do that. And so we can have some problems if it's too much.
I have a question. So the lymphatic system is sort of connected to the immune system?
Definitely. Yeah, it's a big part of the immune system. Yeah, we'll go into that. All right. We're going to watch Hank, and then we'll kind of review everything that Hank goes over. My computer's been really slow with loading videos. This one's coming up pretty quick. Let me go back and redo my share because I don't think I optimized the sound in video. Now we should be better. And it did this the last time too. Eventually it played, so I'm optimistic that it's going to kick on here in a second. Here we go.
Let's say you're at the airport. You're waiting in line to get through security. You're in your socks, in public, and you're wrestling with those plastic bins, and people are yelling at you about dumping liquids and taking your laptop out of your bag. But even with a certain amount of chaos, the line moves pretty quickly. I mean, it should, theoretically, because really everyone has the same goal, to get to where they need to be. Now, you probably think at this point that I'm setting you up to talk about stress or anxiety or something, but I am not. Instead, I want you to imagine that security line as being like your blood, moving through your high-pressured circulatory system. And you, my friend, are not just some impatient traveler in a hurry to catch the next plane to Seattle. You are a bit of blood plasma. And the biggest concern of everyone in your queue is just to get delivered to their destination. But the problem with rushing stuff through a blood vessel or through a security line is that if it moves too fast, you run the risk that something bad might get through.
You see his coffee cup? He's giving me a shout out. Got my initials on it. I hadn't noticed that before. I appreciate that from him.
So in the case of the line at the airport, every now and then, the security people funnel some random folks over to a slower line for a full pat down and a bag check. And that is kind of what your lymphatic system does. It takes up some extra fluid, and while it's ultimately helping it get to its destination, it runs a background check to make sure it's legit. It may not be as well known as some of your other more popular organ systems, but your lymphatic system quietly plays a vital supporting role to both your cardiovascular and immune systems. For one thing, it maintains your homeostasis by eventually returning most of the fluid that has been diverted back into your blood. Which is good, because if it didn't, your ankles would swell up like balloons, your lungs would fill with fluid, and your blood volume and pressure would drop to the point where your body would just give up and you would die. But the lymphatic system isn't just another security line. It also has a series of checkpoints that are staffed by special security officers that have the ability to take care of small infections on the spot. Or if they really don't like the looks of what they've found, they can alert the whole immune system to take it down. So for keeping your blood volume levels where they need to be, for keeping you from collapsing from low blood pressure, and for preventing you from dying from a staph infection every time you scrape your elbow, you have to thank the unsung hero of your anatomy, your lymphatic system. Structurally speaking, your lymphatic system consists of three main parts. The first is just your lymph. It's a watery fluid that flows through your lymphatic system. Much of your lymph starts out as blood plasma that gets forced out of your capillaries way down in the capillary beds, where the leakage helps the exchange of nutrients and gases between the blood and the capillaries and the hungry cells in your tissues. The blood capillaries reabsorb some of the fluid, but a lot gets left behind. So much of the rest of your lymphatic system works to soak it up and get it back to where it needs to go, inspecting it along the way. For example, you have a network of lymphatic vessels that help reabsorb the fluid at about 600 or 700 lymph nodes, which are basically checkpoints that monitor and cleanse lymph as it filters through. Then there are special lymphoid organs like the spleen, thymus, adenoids, and tonsils, as well as other lymphoid tissues throughout the body. Some of these organs and tissues house special defensive cells of the immune system to fight infection by gobbling up bacteria and other harmful antigens, all of which we'll get a lot more into in upcoming lessons. Others, like the thymus and spleen, provide a nursery for maturing immune cells called lymphocytes. But to understand the special supporting role that your lymphatic system plays in your body, let's start with its origins in the capillary beds of your circulatory system. You'll recall that these beds are where the capillaries carry blood from your arterioles and your arteries before that, and feed blood into your venules and eventually your veins. This is where the transfer of nutrients and waste takes place, as blood pressures force plasma out of the arterial end of the capillaries and into the interstitial fluid between the cells of whatever tissue you happen to be in. And most of that fluid gets drawn right back into the capillaries on the venous end, thanks to osmotic pressure. But some is left behind. Of the 20 liters a day that's forced through the arteriolar end of all the capillaries all over your body, only 17 liters is taken back up by the venous end. Those other 3 liters? That becomes your lymph. It's almost immediately picked up by nearby lymphatic capillaries that wind their way in and among the blood capillaries, and they're really well suited for their job. Lymphatic capillaries are made of loosely overlapping endothelial cells that look kind of like roofing shingles, forming little flap-like valves that only open in one direction. So when the pressure in the interstitial space becomes greater than the pressure inside the lymphatic capillary, the flaps push open and take in fluid to relieve the pressure. Once the fluid is inside a lymphatic capillary, we can officially call it lymph. Then it flows through successively larger lymphatic vessels to collecting vessels and then the larger trunks, and finally into one of 2 big ducts that feed back into the lowest pressure area of the circulatory system. The right lymphatic duct drains all the lymph collected from the upper right area of the torso, as well as the right arm and the right sides of the head and thorax, and feeds them all into the internal jugular vein. The larger thoracic duct takes lymph from the rest of the body and dumps it into the subclavian vein. Overall, these vessels work a lot like your veins do. They operate under very low pressure, have a series of valves that prevent backflow, and are helped along a bit by smooth muscle in the vessel walls that keep the fluid moving. Okay, so the lymphatic system takes extra fluid that's squeezed out of the blood capillaries and basically mops it up. That sounds handy, but as a living thing that wants to stay alive, what's in it for you exactly? Well, remember, we're talking about recovering 3 liters of blood fluid per day. That's more than half your total blood volume. If that weren't returned to your circulatory system, you'd be looking at a serious drop in blood pressure and little to no oxygen delivery or waste pickup. Plus, any blockage in the lymph system, like from a tumor that obstructs one of your vessels, can be really dangerous, resulting in edema or swelling that can constrain blood flow and lead to serious complications. And finally, don't forget that your lymph also plays a key role in the function of your immune system. Say you scrape your elbow and some bad stuff, like the Staphylococcus bacteria that's covering your entire body right now, infiltrates some of the loose areolar or connective tissue under your skin. Since that tissue is full of interstitial fluid that drains into your lymphatics, which ultimately drain to your heart, you're gonna want to vanquish those bad guys before they have a chance to wreak any havoc. Whatever will you do? Well, this is where your lymph nodes come in. Your body's main lymphoid organs, the lymph nodes, are where your lymph gets close and regular inspection by its resident immune cells, lymphocytes. Depending on what kind of troublemaker they find in the fluid, the lymphocytes might trigger the release of resident macrophages to attack unwanted microorganisms, or they might activate the general immune system outside of the node if they need extra support. The details of how that happens we will get to next time, but for now, just understand that lymphocytes are found in and mature in the loose reticular connective tissue that makes up a large part of the nodes and most of your other lymphoid organs. Now, if a node is overwhelmed by whatever invader it's trying to quell, it may become inflamed. You can actually feel some of your nodes if you poke around the sides of your neck. They feel like little bumps. Little bumps. Yeah, there they are. And noticeably enlarged lymph nodes are often an early diagnostic sign of disease or infection, which is why doctors are always feeling around under your jawline during checkups. But your lymph nodes aren't the system's only checkpoints. You've also got a few special outposts placed at strategic entry points to particularly sensitive tissues, like those in the respiratory and digestive tracts. These are called mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues, or MALTs, because they can be found in mucous membranes around the body outside of the lymphatic vessels. Your tonsils are some of the largest collections of these tissues, which together form a ring around the entrance of the pharynx. There, they can inspect everything you eat and breathe and try to remove any pathogens before they enter the GI tract or lungs. It's a pretty big job, actually, which is why sore throats and swollen tonsils are a common sign of a cold or other infection. Another collection of MALTs, called Peyer's patches, are in the distal portion of the small intestine, providing another checkpoint along the GI tract. And contrary to popular myth, your appendix is not useless, because it too contains a bunch of lymphoid tissue and is conveniently located where it can destroy any remaining bacteria before it can breach the intestinal wall during absorption. Exactly how your lymph and immune cells detect and destroy the unwanted visitors that might otherwise kill you is what we're going to be talking about for the remainder of this course. But for now, you learned how your unsung lymphatic system supports cardiovascular function by collecting, filtering, and returning interstitial fluid back into the bloodstream via a system of lymphatic vessels. We also talked about the system's major role in fighting off infection and how lymph nodes and other lymphoid organs.
All right. Couldn't find my little make him go away buttons. There we go. Now I got him. So nice review. I like my favorite line in that one is that, you know, it's not as well known as your other more popular organ systems. I didn't know they were popular. They're trending. The GI is going viral. I don't know. All right, so there's our classic picture of all these different components of the lymphatic system. So we have dedicated organs that are part of it, things like the spleen. We have other things that are not considered true organs, like the tonsils, like the Peyer's patches, that are, you know, big structural things, but they're not surrounded by like a membrane and kind of really self-contained. They're a little bit more exposed tissue. So that's kind of what differentiates them from an organ per se. And then, you know, the biggest components are going to be all those different vessels, and then the lymph nodes in combination with all those different vessels kind of working together to hopefully screen us out and prevent bad organisms from attacking our body, to identify cancerous cells that might have gotten into the circulation and try and neutralize those or minimize their spread a little bit too. And it's not always successful. Clearly we get infections, people get cancers that metastasize and spread that have basically made it through the lymphatic system without being contained. But for most, you know, infections and things like that, we can usually do a pretty good job of identifying it. Certainly it helps if we've been exposed to a given virus or bacteria previously, or have been vaccinated for that particular organism previously. That's going to kind of set our immune system response up to be way more successful than if we haven't. And that's what we're seeing with this COVID, is nobody's ever been exposed to that organism, and so we don't have the antibodies that we need to kind of fight it. And until enough people get it, or until we get a vaccine, then that's going to be kind of the situation. So it definitely, you know, the lymphatic system is really important for overall health, even though it is, as he mentioned, not one of our more popular, well-known organ systems. So again, we talked about antigens when we talked about cells, and how those antigens are going to have those little projections on the outside of the cell that helps these different immune system cells recognize, hey, that's an invader, that guy's not one of us, we need to do something about it. And so we'll look a little bit about which of the immune cell types kind of do what within that general immune response as we kind of work our way through. All right, let's kind of talk about the vessels themselves. So
is vaccine like something that, so the virus has certain things that gives off what markers of what it's bad, and and the cells recognize it, like police cops, like that's a suspicious activity, going to investigate. Yeah, that's bad sound. You're going down.
Pretty much, yeah. But again, if we've never seen it before, we don't necessarily know it's a bad guy until something bad happens. So if we've seen it before or we've been exposed to it before in some way, then our body's already kind of recognized that, hey, this thing could be problematic. It might come back in the future. Let's kind of be wary of it and kind of keep a watch for it. So at the distal end, we've got our capillaries, and these are basically woven in with the capillary beds of the normal circulation, of the blood flow circulation. The capillaries, as they come back and get closer to the heart, they're going to merge together, so like little creeks merging into a bigger river, and then they become vessels. Vessels are a little bit thicker walled. They're going to be like veins in that they have an internal valve. In addition to, some of them probably have some of the little side flaps that let a little bit fluid in. But as you start moving into thicker and thicker vessels, then the wall is going to get thicker. You're going to have more of a muscular component, and it's not really going to be able to absorb the lymph as much as it just carries it. So the capillary ends are really where we're best at actually soaking everything up. And the vessels are really more about just transporting it once it's gotten there. As those vessels get closer and closer back to the heart, they're going to merge together and form trunks. So we have a number of trunks that are essentially going to collect like all of the lymph from the arm. We'll have a trunk. We'll have a trunk from each leg kind of coming up. We'll have trunks coming down from the head. So kind of these big sections of the body kind of have a dedicated trunk. And then once we get to the trunks, then we're going to dump into one of the two ducts. And it's a very asymmetrical system, in that the right lymphatic duct really just drains the right half of the face, the right arm, and kind of the right upper chest. The left side, we don't call it the left thoracic duct, it's just the thoracic duct. That collects everything from the lower half of the body, both sides, as well as everything that the right side does in the upper body, plus it does everything in the abdomen too. So the right's a way smaller component of it, and I'm not really sure why we're set up that way, but that's the way they've figured it out. All right, so we talked about those capillaries and how they have their little flaps. And these pictures are pretty similar to what we saw in the little video image. Again, these, I don't think they're actually green. I think they just show them that way. But they are really small, but they are identifiable. I will tell you they're really small because, I mean, capillaries are tiny. And so I've done cadaver dissection, and I don't really ever remember readily identifying lymphatic vessels. I think I probably wasn't looking for the really big ones, like up where they dump back into the circulatory system. It's a lot easier to find veins and arteries, but these are pretty small, and they're definitely not as robust and visible as the components of the circulatory system.
It's interesting that those little flaps, the little doors that open up and allow the fluid in, that they open out. It seems like they have to overcome the pressure because they fill through the difference in pressure inside and outside. So those little doors have to open against the pressure to let the stuff.
Yeah, because they are, in this image at least, they look like they do have to kind of be lifted up. I know in the image that they showed in the video, one half of that vessel, it went this way, and the other half it actually indented in. So I'm not sure if that drawing is totally accurate. But yeah, the external pressure, I think if you think about, rather than if we've got an overlap like this, well, let me put it like this. It's probably not so much that this one has to open up as it is that the inferior one gets pushed down from the pressure coming in. And so that's probably what makes it gap. And then once the pressure is greater inside the vessel, then it's going to basically push that back up against it. So I think that might be a little bit more the mechanism rather than the top one lifting, it's that the bottom one gets pushed down, if that makes sense on how that might work. We've got a lot of protein inside that lymphatic vessel, and that also creates an attractive force to pull water in. We want to equilibrate everything in the body, and so if we have a higher concentration of proteins inside that lymphatic vessel, we want to just pull in more water to kind of dilute it a little bit. And so the buildup of external pressure in that interstitial fluid pushes some of that liquid in there. but also having a lot of protein inside the vessel supplements it by creating this osmotic draw that wants to kind of help promote some of that water movement. So a couple different mechanisms that help us absorb that extra fluid. All right, so when I talked about the GI tract, so specifically in the small intestine, we have these lymphatic capillaries that they have a separate name for called lacteals. And the fluid that it picks up is kind of a more milky white. And that's kind of, I don't know if it's related to how they figured out this word, because lactate, lactose, those are terms related to milk products. Lactation is creating and emitting breast milk. So I'm not sure if that's where that comes from. Somebody just said, hey, that looks kind of like breast milk or something. And they said, let's call these lacteals. But they do pick up a lot of the fats. So the capillaries for the circulatory system are going to pick up more of the carbohydrates and proteins. But for whatever reason, the lymphatic vessels are what help us transport a lot of the fats from the gut and get it back into the circulation. And so that particular type of lymph has a special name because its consistency and everything is a little different. So it's called chyle, is what they call that. So our lymphatic capillaries are going to merge, get bigger, and become lymphatic vessels. Those do have valves in them, so that helps, just like the veins, keep things moving. Even though it's a really low pressure, because it's a low pressure system, we kind of need those valves to help. They do think that the lymphatic vessels have a kind of like a rhythmic kind of contraction of the smooth muscle surrounding them. They estimate that it's between like 5 and 10 beats a minute, essentially, that it's going to contract slowly and relax slowly, contract slowly. It's like every 5 seconds or so, it's going through one of those rhythmic contractions. And so that's going to supplement the movement of that lymphatic fluid. And then every time we move our body, we're basically pulling on the things that kind of bind down those lymphatic capillaries into our body. And just the sheer movement of our body is going to help kind of also open up those flaps and help absorb more fluid, as well as compressing the vessel as we contract muscles, as we shift body positions. And those kind of things are also going to kind of help milk that lymphatic fluid back up, kind of like the muscle pump does for the veins. When we talked about the veins last time, how they have that ability to kind of muscle contraction is going to compress and squeeze on those veins, and that's going to push that blood back uphill. Kind of similar mechanism. So we've heard these terms afferent and efferent before as they relate to the nervous system. Afferent is our sensory side that's carrying messages to the central nervous system. Efferent's the motor side that's carrying those messages out. And so we use that same terminology when we refer to the lymphatic vessels coming into a lymph node or leaving a lymph node. So an afferent lymphatic vessel carries that fluid into the lymph node. The lymph node is going to check that blood or check that lymph for microorganisms, for cancerous cells, things like that. And then once it's decided that the fluid is safe to keep moving through, then it's going to travel through that efferent lymphatic vessel. And then that would eventually make it back to those lymphatic trunks and then the lymphatic ducts to make it back into the primary circulation system. All right, so these are showing the lymphatic vessels and their internal valves. The way that they show this one, it looks like just a single cell wall thick. And that might be the case with some of these vessels that are kind of transitioning from being a lymphatic capillary to being a smaller lymphatic vessel. But the bigger lymphatic vessels, from everything I've read, have like a 3 or 4 cell or a 3 or 4 layer wall, just like a vein and artery have a 3 or 4 layer wall. And so if we have multiple layers, then it's going to be really hard for us to actually split those layers and absorb fluid. We really need that single layer to be able to really help things move across it very well. So I'm not sure about the accuracy of this image based on what I've read about lymphatic vessels. Usually they are described as having that muscular layer as well as kind of an outer protective layer and this innermost layer that's kind of being shown here. So we do have the internal vessels, but I'm not 100% sure how capable of absorbing more fluid into these level of vessels are compared to the lymphatic capillaries. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so these are our primary trunks that we see. So as we start getting closer back to the central part of the body, all the more peripheral lymphatic capillaries, lymphatic vessels are going to merge and dump their contents into these trunks. So we have jugular trunks, be right and left side, subclavian trunks, again, right and left side, bronchiomediastinal trunks, basically going to drain that lymphatic fluid from the upper chest area around the heart and the lungs, and then intestinal trunks for that abdominal cavity, and then the lumbar trunks are going to be picking up all that fluid from the legs. Are you guys seeing that? Yeah, you guys are seeing the image. I had some quizzical looks, and I was like, is my image not showing? But it is. All right, so here's kind of a nice picture of how these larger trunks and ducts are kind of organized in the body. You can see the vertebrae in the back, and so these lymphatic vessels, these big ones, are right up against the spine, essentially. So we've got our big blood vessels there as well. The aorta, inferior vena cava are going to be located in that area too. So it's a nice protected deep space in the body, so it's hard to kind of disrupt these bigger lymphatic vessels because they are so deep. If we look down at the bottom, this is going to be where the fluid from the legs would be coming in. We have this really large swelling, and that's called the cisterna chyli. So it is a bigger collection area essentially for that lymphatic fluid. We're going over the lymph system with the second years and talking about how to kind of treat lymphedema for those patients. And one of the techniques that we do is kind of basically rubbing the person's belly, literally, to kind of compress and squeeze this cisterna chyli is kind of the theory, so that we can kind of help milk some of that collection of lymphatic fluid out of there and get it moving higher up, so that we can get it back into the systemic circulation. So that's one component of the lymphatic massage techniques that we'll talk about next year at this time. So this large central vessel coming all the way up through the middle, that's the thoracic duct. So that's what ultimately is collecting all the fluid from like at least 3/4 of the body, because the right is just doing, again, that right face, the right arm, and that right upper trunk. So it's really more than 3/4 of the body, because essentially the abdomen is also draining into that thoracic duct through and these would be some of the trunks probably that are coming in on the side that you can see kind of merging in this way in parallel with the ribs, essentially. And the ribs are probably protect those vessels to a degree too. By having that outer hard bone, if that vessel is just behind it, then it's got some direct protection from any kind of body blow or crush injury that we might have. So if we look up at the top, again, we have more trunks that are kind of merging together. And both of these big lymphatic vessels, the right lymphatic duct and then just the thoracic duct, are going to dump in essentially right where the subclavian veins come in and the jugular veins come in. So somewhere in that spot. And so I think Hank mentioned that I think the right one actually comes in more at the jugular and the left one comes in more at the subclavian, but it's really kind of right at that notch where those two vessels are merging. It kind of comes in, and sometimes they call that the venous angle, where those two big veins are kind of meeting up. So we're going to dump all that lymph that's been collected back into these big vessels that are ultimately going to lead into that superior vena cava and then go into the right atria so that we can start pumping them through the circulatory system. So it just gets mixed up in those big veins and in the heart chamber and just becomes one again with the plasma that was originally part of the circulatory system. And again, it's going to have a lot of proteins in it, and then those proteins are going to, again, be circulated throughout the body. If some cells need some of those things, great. If not, they're going to end up going back through the liver and kind of being modified so that we can do what we need to with those particular protein structures. Or they're going to go through the kidney, and the body's going to say, you know what, I'd like to recycle that stuff, but we already have a lot of that. Let's just send it out, and we'll worry about holding on to some more of that later. So liver and kidney play a big role in kind of finalizing the final product of our blood, basically. So that greenish, kind of ghoulish looking color, that's just trying to show you which areas are drained by which of those primary ducts. So the darker green is just that right lymphatic duct. The lighter green is all of the rest of the body's lymphatic fluid is going to get dumped into that thoracic duct where we have that cisternic hylae, and that's going to go into the left kind of venous angle.
And
Alright.
they both end up back in the vena cava, correct?
Yes, yeah, they're both going to come in and basically merge and flow into the superior vena cava. Yeah, and then to the right side of the heart. All right, so our lymphatic cells that kind of patrol those lymphatic spaces, as well as other parts of our body and our circulation, we've identified a few different ones that are kind of key. And we talked about some of these early in the semester. We've got our macrophages. Those are typically monocytes, and those are a type of white blood cell that basically helps gobble up things so we can destroy them and break them down. So they're an important thing. And they do sort of roll by what they say presenting the antigens to other lymphoid cells. Essentially, it's like, they capture it by engulfing it. And then as they are dealing with that thing internally, the little antigens will project out of the body's own macrophage. And so it's almost like, I don't know if you've ever had a dog or somebody, a pet that brings something into you. It's like, oh, look what I found. I caught a lizard, or I caught this. It's like bringing it in. Look, Dad. My brother had this dog one time. He was sitting at his kitchen table, and he had this door that the dog could come in and out of. He was reading the paper, doing something. All of a sudden, he hears this thud, and his dog had brought up this possum that it had caught and presented it to him. Look what I got. And so when we look at these individual cells, those macrophages are important because they're going to capture that thing and go, hey, do you want to do something about this virus, this bacteria that I've gotten? And so then the B cells and the T cells, which we'll talk about a little bit later, or the NK cells, then can do something about it and mount a bigger response and look for more similar ones like that. Basically kind of start calling out the cavalry to say, hey, we found this invader. If there's one, there might be more of them. Let's kind of see if we can find any more in the rest of the body. And so we'll get this kind of immune response that we see. We've got some epithelial cells that are going to basically secrete some things in the thymus gland. The thymus gland is a really important organ in the lymphatic system, and that can stimulate production of some other cell types that help us, mostly the T cells. Dendritic cells, we have those in our nervous system, and the dendritic cells are just things that are stationary immune cells that also kind of help us identify things a little bit. And so again, kind of similar to the macrophages, they're going to be able to internalize the antigens and help the T cells and the B cells, which are lymphocyte cell types, to kind of recognize, hey, I caught this thing. Do you want to do something about it? So that's kind of some of the basics of how the roles of these different cell types help the lymphatic system and the immune system work together. So T cells, B cells, and NK cells are three types of lymphocytes, and each, at least the T's and the B's, have kind of subtypes too. I'm not sure if the NK cells have a subtype. And so these have different roles. We'll kind of look at what each of them do. The NK cells are basically, they don't need another cell to present the antigen to them in order to do something about it. They're moving through our circulatory system and our lymphatic system, and they're able to independently identify these things and take action. And essentially what they usually do, we have also what are called cytotoxic T cells. And so both the cytotoxic T cells and the NK cells use essentially enzymes called perforins that cause perforations in the cell walls of the viruses and the bacteria and things like that, that basically makes them leaky. And so if they're leaky, then they're either going to lose their fluid or they're going to be able to absorb too much fluid and grow too big and basically rupture. So they basically stab them. I mean, you can think of it, they kind of poke holes in them. And in most cases, I don't think they really bleed out. It's more like, now I can pull in more fluid. And again, it's related to osmotic tension. We've got a lot of structures inside of all of our cells that want to basically draw more fluid in to kind of dilute them. And if we create an opening by poking a hole in them, then they can basically get too big and then the cell walls burst and then that that
Can-
cell's toast.
Can I make a parable to that one TV show I was watching? Cells at
Yeah.
Work? I think the natural killers were like white cells with little daggers that like kill all the germs.
Yeah. And you know, when we have autoimmune disorders, and we have a lot of different autoimmune disorders, type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder, rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune disorder. Essentially, something goes haywire in the body where the body's, these different types of lymphocytes usually get out of control and they fail to recognize our body's own cells and start attacking them and create this inflammatory destructive process. So we want these things to work right, and they do kind of each have a specific role. So let's look at those. So our T cells are the most common ones. And when we look at somebody like that has HIV, for instance, when they're tracking the effectiveness of the medications that they're giving an HIV patient, they're typically going to be tracking the T cell count to know if that person's immune system is functioning at a high enough level. And if your T cell count gets too low, that means you're going to be very susceptible to catching diseases because you just don't have enough of these things to mount the good fight that we need. So we've got our helper T cells, and these are more about identifying and sounding the alarm. And then once the alarm is sounded, then these cytotoxic T cells, in addition to the NK cells, are going to be the ones that actually take things out. So these are more, the helper Ts are more like the sentries, essentially, that sound the alarm, that those citizen watch kind of programs. The citizen watch, they shouldn't go out there and confront the burglar. They need to call the cops. The cops are the cytotoxic T cells and or the NK cells. The helper T cells are just more like the citizens are like, hey, I saw some shady characters hanging out in the hood. Why don't you come investigate? So you don't need to know anything about these CD4 receptors or any of that stuff. But the helper T cells, the way that they sound the alarm is by secreting what are called cytokines. And so if you've been paying attention to anything about the COVID response, the people that get really, really sick, they often say they have this cytokine storm. And essentially, it's just a massive release of cytokines that cause a widespread inflammation response throughout the body that then ends up damaging a lot of structures like in the lungs and in the heart and ultimately cause these people to not be able to recover from the effects of the disease in a lot of cases. And so they've found that using dexamethasone, which is a very simple corticosteroid compound that we use in PT actually for doing what treatment called iontophoresis, are really effective at calming down this inflammatory response caused by this massive release of these cytokines. We need the cytokines to generate an inflammatory response in an appropriate amount to trigger other cell types to come in and help fight the battle. But if we release too much, then we can cause damage to the body, much like an autoimmune response would. So our cytotoxic Ts, again, they're going to typically secrete this enzyme that's called perforin, is the most common one, that basically just bores a hole, kind of dissolves a hole through the cell wall so that now fluid can move in and out of that cell and cause destruction of the cell that it has successfully perforated. We do have in the T cells, we have a couple different subtypes. We have memory T cells, and we'll talk about those with B cells too. And these are the things that are related to previous exposure to a given virus or related to when we get a vaccine. The vaccine is basically trying to replicate a previous exposure so the body has the ability to create antibodies against it. And so that's what these memory cells do. They basically stay in the body to some degree so that we can recognize if that organism gets into our body again. And one of the things that they're not sure about with COVID is how long do those memory T cells persist at high enough levels to be helpful. And so that's one of the challenges of creating a vaccine is we need to get a response that is fast acting, but also long lasting. And if it fades over time, then it's like the flu shot, you have to get a new one every year. And so I'm envisioning that that's probably going to be at least the initial vaccines for COVID will probably be ones that it's not like, measles, mumps, rubella, where you get it once and you're kind of done. And your body is able to kind of keep those helpers or those memory cells at high enough levels to help for years in the future. It's going to be a more shorter term effect. And some things like a tetanus shot, you can basically, that's like every 10 years you're supposed to get if you have exposure to puncture wounds and things like that. That's longer lasting than the flu. And part of the problem with the flu is that every year it's a little bit different. And so they kind of have to tweak that vaccine a little bit to try and anticipate what's going to work against this year's crop. And it may be that, that the COVID one is going to morph and that every year we have to kind of redesign the vaccines a little bit. And some years we might be better at it, just like the flu vaccine. Some years it's more effective than others, depending on what actually emerges. And it's hard to predict. And then our regulatory T cells should be things that kind of help limit that excess cytokine storm. It creates a needed inflammatory response, but not an overdrive inflammatory response. So that's kind of the purpose of these regulatory cells. Yes, we need that inflammatory response for a number of reasons, but we can't have it be too much or it's going to damage the body.
Isn't it a lack of T cells that play a role in type 1 diabetes? Where do the T cells play?
Well, type 1 diabetes is more that at some point the body has attacked specific cells that create insulin in the pancreas, what we call the islets of Langerhans. I think it's the B cells in there. But it's, and by damaging it, then it can't produce enough insulin so that every time that person eats, their blood sugar level rises and they can't bring it down because they can't make the hormone that's going to help them reabsorb that. But I'm not sure it is genetic. So it can be passed on, and it is a defect essentially where the immune response kills off some of the body's own cells that produce that insulin. So I'm not sure if it's the T's in particular that are responsible for that response. I'd have to look into that to know for sure. All right, so let's look at this slide. So let's say this is our macrophage that has gobbled up this invading cell. It's internalized the antigens of that invading organism, and it's projecting them on the outside of its cell. It's like, hey, I got this thing inside. I checked his ID. Do you want to look at his ID too? And so now this helper T cell is like, oh, yeah, you're right. That guy doesn't have his green card. He's not supposed to be here. And let's send out the chemical message. So all these little red dots are the cytokines. At the same time that that initial helper T cell is sending out some cytokines, it's like, I can't make enough cytokines on my own, so I'm going to go ahead and divide and clone myself. And now all my clones can kind of help me send out that message. So it goes through mitosis, creates additional cells that are identical to it that are recognized, hey, we've got this invader. Let's call in the cavalry. So again, these these helper T cells aren't doing anything to kill off the antigen or the virus or the bacteria themselves, but they're calling in the people that can do something about it. So those cytokines are going to activate these B lymphocytes. And the B lymphocytes, we've got two different types. We've got memory B lymphocytes, and then we have what are called plasma B lymphocytes. And the memory B lymphocytes are just like the T memory cells. They're just kind of always there trying to recognize an invader. But the plasma B cells are the ones that will kind of do like we see with this middle picture of this slide. They're going to multiply and start spewing out tons and tons of antibodies so that we have a much greater chance of encountering of an antibody encountering those antigen-bearing cells so that they can help, again, latch onto them, make it harder for that cell to divide and infiltrate the body, and then buy some time, essentially, for a cytotoxic T cell or an NK cell to kind of get there and finally take that thing out of its misery. So the antibodies that the B cells make are kind of more like a monitoring bracelet. If somebody's got a felony record and they get released from prison or whatever, they have to wear that ankle bracelet that sends the GPS about where they are all the time. It's kind of what it does. It latches on to these cells by binding to them and then that cell has a change in its shape and it can't really do what it wants to, and it has a hard time making new cells or burrowing in and infiltrating spaces in the body because it's got this attachment to it. And again, it's going to buy some time so that now we can get these cytotoxic T cells activated. We can form some more macrophages, so the macrophages can kind of keep gobbling these things up and ultimately wait for somebody else to help them destroy them, or until an NK cell comes along. So it's a multifactorial response. Again, in most cases, the helper Ts are going to kind of initiate that immune response. It's going to be supplemented by the B lymphocyte production of antibodies to, again, help identify and kind of start corralling and slowing down this. And then ultimately, those cytotoxic T cells are what are going to take them out in most cases, if we're successful. If we're not successful, then we get really sick. And sometimes we need help, whether it's an antiviral that have some kind of an effect, or antibiotics that generally are way more effective than antivirals. So there's our cytotoxic T cell. He's dissolving some holes in the wall of this infected cell. And that infected cell is going to ultimately die off, and now we can move on to the next one, try and take that one out. So that's kind of the firing squad, essentially, are those cytotoxic Ts. So our B cells, I kind of mentioned, they're the ones that make antibodies. We have a number of different what are called immunoglobulins, and those are essentially antibodies. The IgG is kind of the main class. We have some other types that we'll talk about in some later classes that are related to, like, if you're allergic, which ones are prone to be released, if you're like respond to poison ivy or bee stings, those kind of things. That's kind of an overdrive of too many antibodies. It's kind of a hyperactive response, kind of like that cytokine storm. But the IgGs are kind of the primary ones. And having worked in hospitals for a long time, when somebody has an accidental exposure to somebody that has a known disease, like let's say a nurse is drawing blood on an HIV patient, and then as she pulls the needle out, she accidentally pokes herself. They're going to send them down to employee health, and they're going to get an injection of immunoglobulins, essentially a whole bunch of these IgGs to boost their body's own response to this exposure and try and give them a better chance to take that virus out before it has a chance to infect them. So those IgGs are a pretty important part. Again, those B cells are activated by these helper Ts, and then either are going to become a plasma cell or a memory cell. We make a lot more of the plasma cells than the memory cells. The plasma cells are the more important ones for that immediate response to generate all those antibodies. The memory cells are the ones that we want to linger around, and that's what are created when we get vaccines. They're going to be the memory cells for the T cells and the B cells, or if we come down with the flu, then we shouldn't catch that same strain of the flu that year because our body will already have these memory cells in place. And we'll be able to then recognize when that thing comes in and trigger that massive production of B cells and cytotoxic T cells and everything else that we need to ultimately protect us when it works.
So it's the lifespan of those memory cells that basically decide when we need to get boosters for our vaccinations?
Yeah, to a degree. And I mean, somewhat for organisms that don't have significant changes in their structure, then it should provide long-lasting effect. And that's where the flu is harder because it typically changes a little bit different. So every year isn't the same specific virus type. So we kind of have to get that new shot every year if we want to get the benefits of having that new shot. But yeah, for something that's more long-lasting, like measles, mumps, rubella, or diphtheria or typhoid, or some of those other ones that we only get once in our life, or maybe once and then a booster. And sometimes you do need a booster for some of these things, and that's kind of like the tetanus boosters you would have. All right. Let me see where I was. Over here. All right. So we just talked about all those, the plasmas and the memories. All right. So here's our graphical description of how that happens. We get that cytokine release from those helper T cells. that are recognizing that antigen. We're going to have a B lymphocyte with the antigen that binds to it, and it goes, okay, I recognize this antigen is in the body. Let's do something about it. Just like the cytotoxic or the helper T cells do, it goes through mitosis so that we can basically clone this first B cell that had the proper antibody on it. And we can create either the plasma cells that just start spewing out millions upon millions of these antibodies to flow through the circulatory system and the lymphatic system, or it becomes this memory cell that is essentially just looks just like the initial memory cell that contacted that thing in the first place. And so ultimately, this mass production of antibodies really just helps further corral and identify invading organisms so that those cytotoxic T cells or the NK cells can kind of take them out. So our NK cells, again, don't worry about the receptor numbers and all that kind of stuff. Just kind of know the role that they play. They can kill. They don't have it. They're not antigen specific. So they're like flu virus. Sure, I'll take you out. HIV virus. Sure, I'll take you out. Strep virus. Sure, I'll take you out. Or Streptococcus bacteria, Staphylococcus bacteria. I'll take you out. So they're way more versatile. And like I said, they don't need anybody's help to identify anything. They have that unique ability to basically say, anything that looks shady, I'm not asking questions, I'm just taking you out. So they're a much more wide-ranging response, but they're a lot smaller in number. So we don't have that many. So they're like the special forces kind of thing. It's limited, select group. They're the SEAL team. They're the ones that basically, know how to use all the weapons. They can act in any environment and still be effective in decreasing the threat. But I'm sure if we had too many of them, we'd start attacking ourselves more.
Can't they move like do cell walls and stuff and just
The NK cells, I wouldn't think so, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
Not that many things have the ability to move through walls that effectively. If they have the cloaking device, if they have the cloak, like Harry Potter, then maybe they could like open the door quietly and nobody would notice. But I don't think that. I mean, that would have to kind of be the structure. If they have a lot of fats in them, then maybe they could pass through a fatty wall. But that would kind of be the only mechanism I could kind of envision where they would get in there without damaging anything else. If they're penetrating through a cell's wall, they'll probably have destroyed that cell. And we don't typically want to destroy our own cells unless they're already infected and they're a lost cause and they know that we can't heal that cell because that virus has gotten in there, then they will kill the body's own cells. All right, so there's our different types. Again, if you look over here on the antigen response, everything except for the NK cells are very specific. So the antibodies for last year's flu virus won't necessarily help against this year's flu virus. We need a different one. They're very precise about which things they can identify. They can pass by plenty of other shady suspects, but if it's not the shady suspect they're looking for, they're just going to let that thing go on by and not do anything because they don't recognize that it's bad. It needs to be the correct one. And so we need tons and tons of these different ones. And I can't remember the exact number that we have. I think it probably does mention it in the book, but there's like probably millions of different specific antibodies that we have in the body for all these different things that we could be exposed to. All right, so lymphopoiesis, we've seen that last half of that word when we talked about different blood cell types. And so this is just the process of making these different lymphatic cells. And the primary places that we make them, we have those terms, the B cells and the T cells. The B cells, the stem cells that make those different B lymphocyte types are originally in the bone marrow. The T cells that make the stem cells that make the T cells typically are originally kind of found and housed in the thymus gland. And so that's where the T comes from. When we're a little kid, the thymus gland is really big. And then as we get older, it really shrivels up and people are like, well, we're not really sure why it does that and what's going on. But essentially, we need it to be a little bit bigger initially because we're trying to seed these stem cells that are making these T cells, and they'll end up finding their way to some of the other lymphatic organs, like potentially the spleen, and then be able to kind of take up residence there and make the T cells from that location. But it's not like the original place that they were found. So if you think about, like, I don't know, a manufacturing company that originally their home base was this, and then they've grown and now they have a branch office over here, kind of the same deal, except in the case of these T cells, I think the original home office kind of gets shut down. But the thymus gland is kind of the original place where the body first starts making T cells. But it does not seem to function that same way throughout our life for whatever reason.
Given its location, I was curious whether or not it would be damaged during CPR.
It could very well be. I mean, because it is right under the sternum, basically right between the heart and the sternum. So yeah, it could very well get damaged. It wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
Maybe more so in a child when it's so big.
Yeah, and when it's more functional. You know, if we damage it when we're older and it's really not that important as we get older, then it's probably not nearly as much of a big deal. But yeah, if you think about somebody having open heart surgery, I'm not really sure what they do with that to get to the heart. If they just like kind of retract it and kind of pull it to the side so they can get at what they need to do on the heart. I'm not sure on that. And I don't think these lymphoid cells are anywhere near as big as they are shown in this slide. It's not that we can only fit 5 of them on top of a vertebrae. I'm quite sure they'd be tiny, itty bitty things. But again, B cells in the bone marrow, and as well as the NK cells, and then the T cells, originally the stem cells are found in that thymus gland before they do migrate and become functional in other parts of the body. We've got our lymphatic nodules. These are different than lymph nodes, and I don't think Hank in the video mentioned that term of lymphatic nodules, but these are some of the things like the tonsils and the malts that he talked about, the mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. So they're not, like, say, self-contained, encapsulated organs like a spleen might be, but they do still have clusters of these cell types that help support the lymphatic system in general. So let's look at the different types. So we've got our malts. Again, the biggest malt is going to be in the small intestine, these Peyer's patches. And I'm sure that's just some dude named Peyer that found them, first identified them. But everything that gets absorbed through the mucosa of the small intestine is going to kind of pass through these malt areas, so that before we let that thing get into our bloodstream, we've got a way of kind of identifying whether it's safe to do that. And so we've got all these different kind of things. And in the tonsils, you think about when we're eating, another reason to chew your food really well, like Mama said, if we keep that stuff in the oral cavity longer and we kind of grind it up into smaller pieces, we increase the surface area of that stuff. And then as we swallow it, it's a little bit easier for the tonsils to kind of latch on and potentially recognize something that's coming in and kind of stop it at that level. And the tonsils have kind of like the inner lining of the intestine. We've got all these little folds and grooves and everything that also increase the surface area. So if something does hit them, it has a better chance of being able to kind of lodge and give the tonsils enough time to do what it needs to do to try and stop that organism from getting further into the body. And then of course, if we eat something and it comes in and hits our stomach, that's a really acidic environment, and that can destroy a lot of viruses and organisms too. So there are certain things that they can get into the mucosal linings of our sinuses and cause problems, but if we swallow them, the chemical composition of our gut is going to kill them off before they can get into us. And so that's where certain organisms can penetrate the body in different ways. All of the Staphylococcus ones, if we swallow them, I think it pretty much neutralizes them. But if we have a small imperfection on our skin, that staph bacteria can get into our body and cause a bad skin infection. All right, I don't think you need to know anything about that internal structure. So there's our tonsils. They used to take tonsils out all the time. And when I was a kid, they decided, no, we need our tonsils. They do something good, so we should keep them if we can. And So they really just started giving people antibiotics, and most times you can knock out most of the infections that cause a tonsillitis or a strep throat type of situation and keep your tonsils. My son ended up having his tonsils out. He was getting strep throat like 2 times a year, and every 2 or 3 times a year. And once he started into school, and I would usually get it like 1 of those times a year. And once he got his tonsils pulled, I think I may have gotten strep throat once since then. And I used to get strep throat a lot as a kid, and I have huge tonsils. But we've got kind of 3 different sets. We've got these ones kind of at the upper part of the back of the throat that really are more linked to the sinus cavities, these pharyngeal ones. And then the ones that you can see when you open your mouth and look in the back of your throat are going to be these 2 that are down at the bottom, these palatine tonsils and the lingual tonsils. And then the adenoids are another kind of set of the same type of tissue. So usually when people get their tonsils out, they get both their tonsils and their adenoids out. And it can help with other things too. I mean, it can definitely help with like snoring. If you have really big tonsils, it just makes that airway a lot bigger and makes it easier to move air without having snoring issues. But again, those things are there for a purpose. They're part of our immune system, part of the lymphatic system. And if we're missing them, then some other part of the body's going to have to compensate or things like that. But if it's hyperreactive, like somebody that is prone to getting strep throat multiple times a year, then in many cases it might be the best medical choice to just remove them. So it's kind of gone in and out of favor, I think, doing tonsillectomies. All right, so our true lymphatic organs, these are going to be the ones that have a kind of shell, a surrounding membranous connective tissue border to it, unlike the tonsils, are the thymus gland, the lymph nodes, and then the spleen. So those are our big kind of 3 primary ones. So we'll look at all those and see what they do a little bit. 9:12. So I'm doing not too bad. I think we'll be all right. So we've got a right and a left thymic lobe that essentially are merged. So it's kind of a little bit like butterfly shaped, kind of has a central kind of thing that joins them together. Like a lot of our tissues and body parts, we have an outer cortex, we have an inner medulla. And again, usually they're going to probably have a different role as far as what they're producing. I don't know a ton about the specifics of thymus gland function, but I think researchers don't necessarily either. So this is how big it might be proportionally in a child. You can see the heart and the lungs. And so it is kind of right there in that mediastinum area of the chest, that most central portion. You can see the great vessels of the heart kind of emerging from the top. And then you can see the thyroid gland, which is again the one that's going to be kind of up here closer to our trachea that we can kind of feel a little bit. We can't really feel that thymus gland because it's underneath the bones, so you can't really put a finger on it like you could the thyroid gland. So they are really close together, but it's important to recognize the difference between those 2 things. That thyroid gland really critical for kind of overall metabolic rate, and the thymus gland being much more important with our immune response. All right, so thymus, initially the site of T lymphocyte maturation. And again, in adulthood, we basically just do cell division of the already kind of existing T lymphocytes, more so than creating new ones from the stem cells themselves. And again, I think for the most part, I think those things migrate more to the spleen, and the spleen kind of helps generate some of these too. But initially, I think they go actually from the bone, the stem cells go from the bone marrow to the thymus gland and take up shop in the thymus gland and then start generating the T cells. And then over time, that generation of T cells isn't from the stem cells themselves, but from already existing T cells. I don't think you need to know the details of that. All right, so our lymph nodes, Hank talked about kind of whenever you go to the doctor, if you do have any kind of illness, suspected viral illness, bacterial illness, there always should feel kind of underneath your jawline, because we do have fairly prominent and easy to locate lymph nodes in that area. We've got big clusters of them kind of right there by the armpit, and sometimes you can kind of feel those. They'll feel like little, they're usually about the size of like a little cinnamon red hot type, kind of a roundish little disc type shape to them, so kind of flat but circular. And so those are fairly easy to feel. We've also got big clusters of them in the inguinal region, kind of right where we crease when we flex our thigh, and those are going to be often can be pretty easy to palpate as well. And so if you are seeing or feeling your lymph nodes and you're not sick, that can be a warning sign too, that maybe you've got like some sort of cancerous cell or something like that that is sticking in those lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes are swelling, trying to deal with those things too. So it can be a warning sign. Certainly if somebody didn't used to have prominent lymph nodes and all of a sudden they're like, hey, I don't remember, I didn't used to feel that, and now I feel like 2 or 3 of them right there. It is something that's probably worth getting checked out. If you have symptoms, you're fighting a cold, then that would be normal to see. But I'm talking about at times of good health, you're still noticing these things. Then something internally might be going on in your body that's causing them to kind of freak out and deal with whatever is threatening them or involving them. So I don't want to scare everybody. Don't be a hypochondriac about it. Look for change. Understand what your normal is, and you're better able to identify when it becomes abnormal. All right. I don't think you need to know a ton about the overall structure of the lymph node, but we will look at the diagram and kind of talk about how it works. So this is similar in some ways to our individual neurons. We've got multiple lymphatic vessels that will feed in to a lymph node. And so those would be our afferent lymphatic vessels carrying fluid into the lymph node. That fluid is going to flow through these different internal structures of the lymph node where we can give them the pat down, do that identification. This is the TSA line, essentially. And then once it's been cleared, then it's going to leave through one, or I've seen drawings that have 2 ports going out, but similar to a neuron, we've got lots of things feeding into it, like the dendrites, but only kind of one primary outlet, like the axon. So in some ways, it has kind of some similarities there. I know I was watching the video that I played at the beginning, and they showed the lymph node with 2 of these ports coming out. So I have read that it's only 1, but I have also seen pictures in more than one place that shows 2. But in any event, we have way more afferent vessels coming in than we have efferent vessels going out. So we need these things to work. And one really common complication that we'll see people for therapy for is if somebody has had breast cancer and they have axillary node dissection because they've worried that those cancerous cells in the breast may have spread and gotten into those lymph nodes in the armpit, they'll take all those out. And so if they take those out, then all the lymphatic fluid in the arm, it's hard to get rid of because we basically have this permanent lane closure. We still have the same amount of traffic of fluid trying to escape that arm and get reabsorbed and get back to the circulation, but now we don't have as many places to pick it up. And so that arm will start to swell a lot. And so we'll do different treatment techniques to try and get rid of the swelling, from massage, from bandaging, from exercise routines, to kind of minimize some of that, from positioning, keeping that limb elevated. And then ultimately those people will often get compressive garments, like a tight glove and a tight compressive sleeve that will kind of maintain an external force to kind of help keep squeezing some of that fluid out of there. Because if we're missing all these lymph nodes, we just can't process the same amount of fluid that we would need to, even though we're producing just as much as we ever were. So that's where this will come into play next year. We'll kind of review this, and it'll make more sense because you will have heard about it more, and then be able to apply some of these techniques to try and help with that condition. All right, so the spleen, when we looked at our circulatory system, we have the different arteries and veins. We've got a splenic artery and a splenic vein. Look for if you have an image, and for the quiz next week, and we're asking about what vessel it is, try and trace that vessel, where it's going to and where it's coming from. And oftentimes, especially the ones that are linked to organs, will really help you figure out the name. whether it's a gastric artery or vein, whether it's a splenic artery or vein, that type of stuff. So our spleen's a pretty dense organ. It does hold a lot of blood, and it helps us process and break apart dead blood cells or blood cells that are kind of have met their expiration date, so to say. I don't think you need to know a ton of this nitty-gritty detail on it. Let's just look at the functions. So it is going to help with that immune response when we look at our B cell and our T cell responses. So it is a part of that. We do store a little bit of blood in there. So it's kind of our backup blood supply, our backup supply of platelets. If we have a big wound and we start losing a lot of blood, we can kind of mobilize some of those and get them working. But then it also does kind of help the liver and the kidneys in processing some of the body's own parts that are breaking down and are we need to regenerate and recreate, particularly the blood cells. So those last two components are like I say, supplemental to what the liver and the kidneys do in helping us clear waste and broken down stuff that our body's kind of used up. I was watching another video or doing something, I think it was on getting ready for this week, and talked about seals. And apparently seals have a huge spleen that basically serves as an extra oxygen tank for them. So they can store blood that's been oxygenated, that's gone to the lungs in that spleen. And if they need to stay down for an extra minute or two because they're trying to catch that last fish, then they can basically, okay, call in that extra oxygen that I've got stored in the spleen, and they can add that to the circulation and stay down a little bit longer before they have to come back up. So that's a pretty neat adaptation, and it wouldn't surprise me if any other type of diving mammals like that have that, whether dolphin or whales might have it too, walruses, some of those similar type of species. So there's our spleen. It is on the left side, basically right up under the ribs, and really close to the stomach as well. Bring my friend in here. It's kind of like Mr. Rogers with like King Friday, only I've got this weird skinless dude. I don't have a little train that goes around either, sadly. Sure. All right. We took that off. So we've got our abdomen, our intestines, we got our liver, we got our stomach, and we'll go through all these next week as well. And so if I take that out, this part right here is the spleen. I'll bring it up a little bit closer because I know I don't, well, let me shut this off and that'll help a lot. All right, so right there. So you can right up under the diaphragm, right up against the rib cage, but kind of tucked in behind the stomach is where our spleen is going to be. Don't fall over, guys. I really need to give him a name. I gotta start thinking about that. I used to call him the conductor because he stands there like this. He doesn't really do that part though. All right, let me go back to my screen. There we go. So we've got our splenic artery and our vein. So important to know that. This little cutout right here is meant to show us what's on the next slide, which is kind of more the internal structure. And I don't really care that you know that much about that internal structure. Really just know where it's located, and then that previous slide that goes through the functions. That would be the most important thing, both for the upcoming quiz, when we look at the vessels, know that, but then for when we get to the last small written test in the final, just kind of know those functions of the spleen. All right, I think we are done. We are done with that lymphatic system stuff. Yeah. Rest of it goes into development, which we're not going to worry about for this class. So before we take a little break, any questions on the lymphatic stuff that we covered? All right. Looks like about 9:25. So let's take our 10-minute break till about 9:35, and then we'll kind of move into some lab activities. I may end us just a touch early. I'm supposed to meet the second year students at 11, and I kind of need to pack up my lunch and hit the road to get there. But the fact that we're done with this part a little bit early is probably good. So 9:35, be back, and we're going to kind of just review all the blood vessel stuff that we kind of talked about on Tuesday. Just ready for the quiz. All right, looks like it's that time. So we're going to go through the labeling handouts as a group. I've got all your names cut on my little piece of papers and scraps, so I can draw these random names. And as we're doing this, there's a whole bunch of different images. some of them aren't super relevant to the vessel test. So we're not going to go through all, I think there's 18 of them, but we're going to go through kind of the primary ones. And I want you to try and do it without looking at any sources or pictures. Try and think through how they're named, where they're going, where they're coming from. And to me, the more you can just kind of think your way through it, it just makes it easier than trying to just memorize and cram everything. And so if you can kind of just follow what organs it's coming from, is it going away from the body? Is it coming back to the body? And hopefully collectively we'll be able to kind of work through this. If you're kind of getting stuck, I'll try and give you some hints as you're going, but I want you to see if you can do it without looking at any images from your other sources and see how you're doing with that. So let me share my screen so we can all see the same thing right there. And we're gonna start leaving the heart, and then we'll kind of, this particular image is just showing kind of the primary big vessels that are located closest to the heart. And so try and think of the most specific way that you can name a particular section. Can you guys see my cursor on there? Okay, so I'll try and kind of drag my cursor over the kind of top of the section that I'm trying to have you identify whenever it's kind of your turn. And then collectively, if everybody else that's not having their turn can kind of pay attention to what we're asking about, then I think it will really help reinforce it when you see these things on the quiz next week. So my first name is Maddie. So Maddie, what do we call this first little part of this vessel right here? Where's Maddie? She's not there? She disappeared. Now she's back. I'll put her back in the cycle since she wasn't here right at the start. We'll cut her some slack. All right, Abby Melver. So we're moving to you. So this first little section right here, what do we call that particular part of that vessel? So just kind of the section where that first little arrow is.
It's the ascending, so it's going up, but
Yep.
I don't know.
So it's coming off of this left ventricle, and it's red. So that should kind of tell us a little bit about which half of the circulatory system it is. So it is the ascending. We just need the last name of that.
Oh, the aorta.
Yep. So that's our ascending aorta.
Gotcha.
Okay. All right. Mo, what do we call this part? We can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself?
Is it me, Greg?
Yeah.
Oh, it's the arch of the aorta.
Okay,
And-
so we've got our arch. So we've got our ascending aorta, we've got our arch. You probably guess what's coming next.
Me again?
No, not you. I'll run through, we'll get there. All right, so Ashley. Ashley with us? Yes. What do we call this part?
Is it the descending aorta?
There will be our descending. So ascending, arch, descending. Okay, so we're going to keep coming down. We're going past that diaphragm. And Audrey hasn't been with us for a while, so I'm not going to ask her. I won't put her on the spot. So I'll put Olivia on the spot because she's been here. So what do we call this part that's below the diaphragm?
Well, it's still the aorta, right?
Yep.
And it's like carrying the blood to the rest of the body.
Yep.
So would it be like inferior?
It's not interior. It's more based on the region. So think about our body cavities. We have one name for the body cavity that's above the diaphragm, and then we've got a name for the body cavity that's below the diaphragm.
Abdominal aorta?
Yep, so that's our abdominal aorta. And so a real common or fairly common condition that you'll hear people having is a AAA. It's an abdominal aortic aneurysm, where they essentially get a big, the wall of that part of the vessel gets weak and starts bulging. And if that ruptures, you're toast, because that's carrying so much blood. And so they do surgical procedures to try and fix it. And when people have an abdominal aortic aneurysm, sometimes you can actually feel their pulse through their abdomen, because it's just allowing too much blood to kind of stay in that one spot where that wall is kind of bulging out. If you think about like a long, skinny like balloon that people do that tie into little shapes, if you squeeze it in the middle and it would bulge, squeeze both ends and it bulges in the middle, that's kind of what that aneurysm is like. And the longer that pressure goes on, the more likely it could potentially rupture and cause some problems. So I've seen a lot of patients post-operatively after abdominal aortic aneurysm surgery. And so they have to fix it, strengthen it, and kind of then we're dealing with all the weakness associated with having been cut through the belly and trying to help them up. All right.
The aorta and the vena cava run posterior. They run to the back of the body cavity.
I'm sorry, repeat yourself. My sound was down.
So those vessels, the aorta and the vena cava, aren't they behind the organs?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, and so that's what makes it even more remarkable that you can actually feel that person's pulse, because you're essentially feeling their pulse between their intestines, and it's still a strong enough surge of blood that you can palpate it, at least on a leaner person. Somebody that has a lot of body fat, you might not be able to, but if it's somebody that's pretty lean and you're just going through those intestines, it's a big enough pressure wave because of that swelling and that aneurysm that you can actually feel it. So kind of crazy. All right. Next up, Shannon. What do we call this one at the very bottom? That's right next to that abdominal aorta. Say aneurysm.
Well, it's a vein because it's blue.
There you go. Good thought. Yep. That works for almost everything.
Is it the? Tom just said it. Vena cava, vena inferior.
Yep.
Inferior vena cava.
It's the inferior one. Good deal. All right. So let's go again, because blood flow is going from the periphery back to the body. We'll talk about the ones coming back in next and kind of move more centrally. And so Kim, what would we call this one over here?
Is that one the subclavian vein?
Yep, that would be our subclavian. What would be a little more specific way?
The right subclavian vein.
Okay. Yep, so that's our right subclavian vein. How about Abby Bailey? What is this one coming in vertically? Be coming down from the head.
Yeah.
A lot of times you can actually you can probably see mine right along in here.
Why can't I think of it?
Do you want to call in for help?
Sure.
The right common carotid artery.
What color is it?
Oh, vein. It's the
Okay.
right.
It is a vein.
Oh wait, carotid. Is it?
Is it the pulmonary vein?
not the pulmonary. We'll get to that one because that would be going to the coming back from the lungs,
Right. Yeah.
coming out of the head. And so it's not.
Brachiocephalic?
It's not going to be brachiocephalic yet. That would be after it kind of merges.
Hmm.
Is it the jugular vein?
We are jugular. Okay.
Oh.
That's your jugular. So have you ever heard about somebody cutting their jugular? Cut the kind of somewhat common phrase.
Right.
That's the jugular. It's the most superficial, really big vein that's draining that blood that the brain's been using essentially back to the heart so that it can get reoxygenated.
Okay.
All right, so Kara, how about this small little merged section that's right in here?
Is that the brachiocephalic vein?
That would be your brachiocephalic. Yep. So once we combine the subclavian and the jugular, then it becomes the brachiocephalic. And so then we'd see that same thing on the other side as well, kind of right there. So other side, same veins. We've got the left jugular coming down, and then we've got the left subclavian vein coming in. And then once they merge, we do have a longer section of left brachiocephalic vein than we do on the right. It's shorter.
How do they come up with that name?
The brachiocephalic.
Yeah.
Brachio refers to arm, and cephalo is for head. And so that's basically the blood supply from the arm is coming in that subclavian vein, and the blood supply from the head is coming in that jugular vein. And so then once they merge, then it's brachiocephalic because it's just telling you what's being carried in that particular section. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yep. All right. So I didn't touch on the other three that are coming off of that arch of the aorta. So Allie, what do we call this little section kind of right here? Coming off that arch. Think about where it's going and what it's splitting into, and that might help you recall. And it's going to be, a similar kind of setup to the venous side that we just went through. You're muted.
Is it the right brachiocephalic
What's the last name?
artery?
Artery. Okay. So right brachiocephalic artery, just like we had those brachiocephalic veins. Okay. So it's pretty consistent with this particular naming. So that's that one. Bryson, what are we going to call this part coming over here?
Is it the right clavicle artery?
It's
artery?
Yeah, subclavian. Yeah.
Maybe.
The subclavian there. Okay. And then Maddie, what about this one going up here? Where did she go? She's out again. I think she's having internet issues. She sent me a message, so we'll skip back. Maybe it's a convenient one, so she doesn't have to answer. All right, so Tom, what do we call this one going vertically?
That's going to be your right jugular, right carotid artery.
Okay, so and it's got another name in there too. So it is the right carotid, but it has a middle name between the right and the carotid.
Right internal carotid artery.
So it hasn't split yet. Part of it will become the internal, and part of it will become
common.
So yeah, so that's our right common carotid artery right there. So the blood flow to the right side of the arm and the head is a little different from the left because the left doesn't have a brachiocephalic. We just have these two individual vessels. So Amanda, what do we call this one?
Is that a jugular artery?
So we don't have a jugular artery.
No? Okay.
We just have a jugular vein. So those are the companion vessels that don't have the same name. Most of the time, the artery and the vein in a given region or going to a place will kind of have the same name, but this one is different. So Tom just talked about this one on this side, and this is basically the same structure just on the other side. So it's going.
So like left common carotid artery.
Yep, showing up. So left common carotid right there. And then Whitney is not here. Take her out of the running. All right, Nick. So what do we call our last remaining vessel that we're going to talk? Well, actually, we'll talk about a couple more on this slide.
The left subclavian.
So there's our left subclavian artery, okay, coming out. All right, let's talk about just our last couple. So, Eric, what do we call this little section right here?
The pulmonary trunk.
Okay, there's our pulmonary trunk. And then Lisa, what do we call these ones going off to the side?
Would it be the pulmonary? Am I on the right track with the pulmonary?
Pulmonary's right. Yeah.
So left pulmonary vessels, maybe valve.
So it is a vessel, but we need to know it's going away from the heart. So which time of vessels go away from the heart?
So vein.
It's blue.
Okay.
But it's going away from the heart. So blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart are called one type, and blood vessels that carry blood to the heart are called one type. So this one is, the colors don't match the names.
Okay, so artery.
Yeah.
This one.
So these are our right and left pulmonary arteries. They're going to then, you can see these loops, and so this is not the complete, you'd have a lot more branches coming off to give blood down to the capillary level to all the individual villi in the lungs, and then it's going to pick it back up and come in with these other ones. And so we've got two sets of pulmonary veins for each side, but only one set of pulmonary arteries. And those are the only vessels that the colors are not going to match the names. The pulmonary veins are going to be red because they're carrying oxygenated blood. The pulmonary arteries are going to be blue because they're carrying deoxygenated blood because they haven't gone to the lungs yet. So that's kind of everything on this slide that I wanted to kind of look through. Let's go to our next one. I've got to flip everybody's name back over. I want to bias myself and, give hard ones to some people on purpose because I don't like them. And so.
I want the hard ones.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind, Eric. Be careful what you ask for. All right.
Go. I'm not even gonna. I'm gonna not try to cheat.
All right. So we already talked about pretty much everything above the diaphragm. So we're just going to focus on these ones that are down below, and then we'll look at. And some of the names are in here, so you kind of have some help with some of these more distal vessels, and some of the names are actually on this slide, but don't pay attention to those names. Keep your focus in the center. Don't look at the periphery. All right. So we're going to go with the tricky ones first. So Eric, since you wanted a tricky one, I'm just going to let you start with this little cluster. So we've got these.
Celiac trunk.
Okay, well, look at that. The celiac trunk.
My study buddy has been trying to get me to memorize.
Okay.
Cecilia, you're breaking my heart, and trying to help me remember that.
Okay. So who can tell me what the celiac artery supplies blood to? Which organs?
You said that was primarily the upper part, right? So like the stomach, the liver, the spleen, kind of that area?
Yep. So all those kind of most upper of those abdominal organs are going to get their blood from that. So if we go down just a little bit, we've got this next one. right here, and the name is on there, so don't look at the name. We'll try and I'll come back to that one when we actually show the vessels, the continuation of the vessels too. But these other two, you've got these three central things that are basically coming out anteriorly from that abdominal aorta. And so in order, we've got the celiac trunk that we just talked about. We've got the superior mesenteric artery and the inferior mesenteric artery. And then we'll look at when they're tied into the gut, then we'll try and have you figure out which one is which, because then I think they're not labeled. All right. Madison back? I don't see her back. All right, so Bryson, what do we call these ones going to the kidneys? Think about what the other name for the kidneys is.
Right renal artery.
Okay, so we've got our renal arteries. Yep, so we've got a right and a left. And, you know, two kidneys, we can live with one. But if you donate a kidney and then something goes wrong with your kidney, then you need a donation of a kidney. So it's a hard choice to donate a kidney. You know, I think a lot of people do it, and it's great that people do that. But it definitely, if they start having a problem later in life with their own kidney, then they're kind of in the same boat as the person they donated it to. All right. So Olivia, what do we call this part right here? Right after it splits. It's no longer the aorta because it's split into two vessels. Think about what this region is called, kind of, and what the bones are called in that area.
I want to say like the pubic artery, but I feel like that's not right.
That's not right. It is the kind of the pelvic region. We've got our abdominal cavity, then we've got our pelvic cavity. So it is kind of running through that pelvic cavity, but it's more related to, the name is after one of the bones of the pelvis. It's kind of the origin for it.
Is it an iliac artery?
Yep. So there's our iliac, there's our ilium on either side, and so you can see that it's splitting. So similar to our carotids up here, we have to add another name in there. So we'd have a right and a left iliac artery, but it's got a middle name between the right and the iliac, or the left and the iliac. And it's related to the fact that it splits. So when something splits, then just like the carotid,
Is it common?
so it'd be common. So yeah, just like the carotid, we're going to have that common section. And then down below it, where it splits, then you can see on the names over here, we've got the internal iliac artery and then the external iliac artery. Okay. All right. Let's look at a different slide because this one's got too many names that I'm trying to ask you. It's too easy. All right. We're not looking at that. We already looked at that. Let's look at this one. So this is the right side, and we've already identified this section here. What's this one's called name? Anybody?
Ooh.
Okay.
Ooh.
Eric?
Okay. Is it the brachiocephalic vein?
Yeah.
Artery.
Yep. So there's our brachiocephalic artery. It splits. There's our subclavian, and then there's our common carotid coming right up there. Okay. So we've already covered those. So Abby Melver, she's still there. Yep. What about this section? After that common carotid splits, what is this one that's a little bit more superficial called?
Is it the external carotid?
Yep, so that's our external. And Ashley, how about this one over here?
The internal, right? The internal.
That'd be the internal. So it's diving in a little bit deeper. Yep. All right. The only other one that I will ask you about on the quiz, we've already had Eric have a couple answers on this round. So Allie, what about this one that's running through these transverse foramen? So it's named after the bones that it runs through.
Did you say me?
No, I said Allie,
Me? Okay.
and you're muted.
Is it intervertebral?
Just vertebral.
Just vertebral artery?
Vertebral, yep. So we've got a vertebral artery. And that artery, those bones help protect it. But if we put a person's head in a certain position, usually what we kind of do what's called a quadrant test, we have them extend, side bend away. It will kind of compress down the side that you're leaning towards and kind of overstretch this side. And sometimes that will cause people to have symptoms where they get kind of lightheaded or woozy. And that's a sign that you're probably getting some compression on that vessel too much that we would want. And so there's certain techniques and certain things that we don't do on somebody if they have those type of symptoms. There have been cases of people, it's not super common, of having really aggressive cervical manipulations done that have sheared that artery and caused the person to die or have a massive stroke from bleeding. So if you ever, sometimes I'll watch some of the really aggressive chiropractic videos where people are just getting all these cracks and pops, and some of those really aggressive movements have been shown to tear that artery specifically. So it's a vulnerable artery, even though it does have that bony protection kind of around it. All right, let's go on to another one, because that's all the ones that you need to know on those. All right, let's look at this guy or gal. I'm not sure if that's a male or a female brain. I don't see the pelvis, so I can't identify it. All right, so Tara, what do you think this one is right here?
Is that also the vertebrae artery?
Yep. So we've got our two vertebral artery coming right up in front of those pyramids and the medulla, and then they're going to kind of merge, kind of right at the junction of the medulla and the pons. And then once they merge, Lisa, what do they call this part right here?
It's like, starts with a B, it's like bus.
Do 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 do.
I don't think that's the Jeopardy song.
Do do do.
It's the Harry Potter song.
I don't know the end of it, but I know it starts with like bass, something.
Yep.
And it's an artery.
It is an artery. So yeah, we've got the either basilar or basilar. Depending on if you like Italian food or if you like Harry Potter. Basilisk. So yeah, it took me a while to catch the song Eric was humming, but Tom got it. So yes, so vertebral arteries merge to become the basilar artery, and then it's going to split. We're going to have this circle of Willis, or this cerebral artery circle, I think they call it now. We've got these little ones that are called communicating arteries that kind of connect, and then we've got this bigger primary vessel kind of coming in. And again, you can see that it's cut. And so the cut end is coming from the heart, coming up, and then it's going to hit the brain. So our last one, I think that we'll do on this particular slide for Nick. Where's Nick? Is he still here? He's not here. He's not going to be able to answer that then. So Tom, what do we call this one here?
Actually, you gotta be more specific. You're pointing at two different ones.
They're right there.
The middle cerebral artery.
Okay, so we've got our cerebral artery. It's going to be coming up from the carotid artery, essentially from that internal carotid. It's going to basically be kind of right where that hits and then it becomes that middle cerebral artery after that is. But its origin is essentially that internal carotid artery. But then, yeah, it becomes that middle cerebral artery right through there. So I think that's everything on this one that we need to worry about. All right, let's look at this arm. So Abby Bailey, we talked about our subclavian artery already. Once it passes under the clavicle, which we see right there, it changes names. So what do we call this portion of that artery that used to be called the subclavian artery? Passing through that armpit area.
Let's see. That's the. Is it the axillary artery?
So the axillary. Yeah. So our axillary artery, and that axilla is that armpit region. So it kind of makes sense that we've got that same name. Mo, what do we call this next section?
The brachialis artery.
Just brachial.
Brachial.
Yeah. So just the brachial artery right there, and it's really the brachial artery all the way down until the elbow, where we see it kind of split. All right, so Shannon, after it splits, we've got this one that's coming down towards the pinky. What do we call that one?
That would be not the ulnar?
Yep, so that's the
ulnar artery.
Right over the top of that ulna. So that's our ulnar artery. Next one should be easy, hopefully. Amanda, what do we call the other one that split off from that brachial artery?
A radial artery.
There we go. So we got a radial. So those are all the ones that you need to know for the quiz. I won't ask you about any of the ones on the hand. So radial, ulnar, brachial, axillary, subclavian. Okay? All right. Now we're getting down to the gut a little bit. Those are our celiac branches. And so we already kind of talked about which organs those go to. So right at the top is where that celiac trunk is, splitting off to the right side. We're going to have what do we call that part? It's going to the liver. Let's see. I don't want to pick on Audrey because she hasn't been in class for a little while. I like picking on people that have been here more. So Kim, what do we call this part?
Not gonna give me the tough ones anymore?
You already got the celiac trunk. That was the hardest part. You can see the organ on these. That makes it pretty easy, hopefully.
Yeah.
So Kim, what do you think?
So is liver heptic?
Hepatic.
Hepatic.
Yeah. So that's a hepatic artery. Let me flip my names back over. I need to put the people out that aren't here, so I don't keep.
Craig?
Yep.
What does hepatic mean? Like, how do we remember that that's?
That's just kind of the term for the liver. I mean, and I'm not sure. It's probably Latin in root, I'm guessing, but that's just kind of the more technical name for the liver. So anything having to do with the liver is going to be hepatic. But I'm not sure ultimately what it means when you break it down. It's been a while.
Hepatitis.
Yeah, hepatitis is going to affect the liver. So those are the diseases that got our different hep A, hep B, hep C, all those different types of hepatitis, for sure. All right, let's go back to Amanda. How about this one that's kind of here? There are a couple different ones. I don't expect you to know a ton of detail about the different branches of this particular one, as far as right or left, but in general, what would we call this type of artery that's attached to the stomach?
I don't know.
Okay, so what's our,
Hepatic.
so we had that hepatic name for the liver. What's the other kind of different technical name for the stomach? Do you
Is
remember
it
that?
gastric?
So that's gastric. So that'd be one of the gastric arteries.
Oh,
right?
okay.
Splitting off that celiac trunk. And then over here in the corner, we can see our spleen kind of tucked up, like say, up against that, between the stomach and that rib cage wall, right up there in that upper kind of left quadrant. And that would be our splenic artery and our splenic vein that would be going that way. All right, let's go to our next one. And we already kind of went over all those. All right, let's look at this one. So, Shannon, we talked about our iliac, our common iliac artery. We've got our internal iliac artery. We've got our external iliac artery. Once we pass that inguinal ligament, that little band of connective tissue, what do we call that artery?
Is it the femoral?
That would be our femoral. Yep. As we continue to go down and we get back behind the back of the knee, what's that change to, Allie? So this is the posterior view on the right side.
It's the popliteal artery.
That's that popliteal artery, or popliteal, you can say it either way. And then coming, I think I'll just stay on the posterior side. It's probably a little bit easier to kind of see this one. What would we call this continuation, Tom? After we pass through the backside of the knee, it changes names again. And this is a posterior image, so that might help.
Are you supposed to answer this one?
For Tom.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm talking here. I didn't have my thing unmuted.
Okay. Yeah, I couldn't see you talking because you don't have your camera. So what do you think?
I'm having button issues here. Sorry. That is tibial artery.
Yep. So, and the tibial artery does split. We've got a few different branches. So if we look at the top, kind of right behind the popliteal fossa here, we've got this first branch that's splitting off, and that's essentially this vessel on the other picture on the left side that's coming down. So we've got two parts to that tibial artery. So the one that I was asking you about is on that posterior view. So that would be our posterior tibial. And then this other one that we see kind of more coming in front of the foot, that would be our anterior tibial. And then we've got the name for the fibular. And so that fibular is this next branch that's coming off. So the posterior is kind of the main continuation of what was the femoral, what becomes the popliteal, and then splitting off of it would be the anterior tibial artery as well as the fibular artery coming back behind there. But the main thickest portion of it really is kind of coming down through that posterior section. And that's as far down as you need to know for these arteries. Don't worry about the ones in the foot. I won't ask you questions about those. All right, moving along. This one, I think, these are all just the same names as the arteries that we just went through. And again, on the quiz next week, it will not have colors in those images. In the way those cadaver slides are, they basically just highlight it with a given color, but it won't necessarily be the red or the blue. But it will give you the option of all your choices will be vein or all your choices will be artery, with the exception of those things that are closest to the heart, where we kind
You can drill that on the dissection tool, right? There's a quiz in there for us.
Yes. Yeah, so just be familiar with those images. But again, when it goes through them, it highlights a given region or body part or whatever in a given color. Sometimes it's like a purplish color to make it stand out a little bit, but it won't match the red and blues that we see with the images from your textbook, where we try and make it really clear. But when we look at the vessels, basically the same arrangement. We're going to have a femoral vein. We're going to have the internal and external femoral veins. We're going to have the iliac vein, excuse me. We're going to have the common iliac vein, and then we're getting back into our, what is this one called? Anyone?
Inferior vena cava.
So that's our inferior vena cava coming up. And then again, we've got renal veins coming back in. We're going to have these same veins that are merging into that celiac kind of trunk area on the arterial system that would be coming from the hepatic vein. We have a gastric vein. We're going to have a splenic vein coming in, all in those locations too. But everything else is pretty much the same. When we look at coming up by the neck, the big difference at that neck region is the carotid for the artery side versus the jugular or the venous side. All right, so speaking of the neck, so we've got these here, and we're really just, the only ones I really need you to worry about would be this one right here, and that's our jugular, okay? And then we've got this one that's running as a companion vessel to those vertebral arteries, and so that's just your vertebral vein coming through there. This is actually the internal jugular, the bigger one. The external jugular is here. We don't have quite the same arrangement that we see with the carotid, where we have that common section and then it splits. These two parts of the jugular are both coming off of that subclavian. Well, they're both feeding into that subclavian vein. Because again, the blood flow is coming top down from the head down on the venous system. So this bigger one is our internal jugular. You can see it kind of tucking in underneath the ears, back by that mastoid process. Whereas this external jugular is going more up into the scalp and helping drain the blood from the skin and from some of the muscles, probably up on the temporalis muscle and things like that there. So external jugular is the more superficial. Internal jugular is the one that's draining blood back from the brain. So that's kind of in addition to that vertebral vein. So similar to how the carotid and the vertebral artery supply blood to the brain, the blood leaving the brain is going to be that internal jugular and the vertebral veins primarily. All the ones that are on the face and the skull, don't worry about those. Just kind of know those big ones kind of right there on the side. All right, so for whatever reason, I didn't originally put together this set of slides. We don't have the arterial system image that shows these companion vessels for the mesenteric vessels, but it does give us some other good things to look at here. So we'll kind of go back to this one. So Mo, these veins that are mostly linked in to the right side of the colon, they would also be connected to pretty much all of the small intestine. What do we call this kind of loop here?
Internal. No, that's not. It's gonna be the gastro. Is that what it is?
So gastric's up here.
It's gonna be tricky. It's not left and right. It's up and down.
Correct. And so when we looked at this, that central portion of the abdominal aorta, and we had those cut ends, we had the celiac trunk, and then we had the two different mesenteric trunks were the next part. So all of these vessels on this lower half are mesenteric vessels. It's just a matter of figuring out which one is looped in to the higher level, or which one is controlled by that lower level.
So the mesenteric inferior?
So mesenteric inferior is going to be this side.
So this is going to be the superior.
So this is our superior. So the right side of the abdomen is where we're looking at this part of the colon over here. That's going to be the same. It's going to be the same for the artery side too. Superior mesenteric artery is doing that right. It does basically most all of the small intestine, and then the right half of the large intestine. The inferior mesenteric artery and vein are more involved with the left side of the large intestine. And the inferior mesenteric artery is the primary one that delivers blood to the large intestine. So those are kind of those two big ones there. Up here we've got our gastric veins, and then our splenic vein as well that's shown. When we get over to the liver, we've got some different tweaks to it. So this part right here, where it's really kind of big and thick, Ashley, any idea what this one is called? Well, let's talk about this whole network. Once all of these mesenteric veins kind of come back in, they don't tie directly into the inferior vena cava like the mesenteric vessels and the celiac vessels on the arterial side are directly linked to that aorta. It has to make kind of a detour and go through the liver first. So any idea what we call kind of this big network just in general?
The hepatic portal vein.
So yeah, that's our hepatic portal vein. So it's basically draining all the blood that we've picked up from the large intestine on both sides, everything that we're picking up from the stomach, everything that we're picking up from the small intestine, which has been taken off so we can see these other structures a little bit easier. And all of that blood is going to get dumped back into this hepatic portal system and then get carried through the liver. So when we were talking in lecture about the lymphatic system, how those lacteal lymphatic capillaries pick up the fats, and that would be mostly with the small intestine where we absorb that, it's going to go to the liver first before it goes anywhere else in the body. Once the liver gets done processing it, then it's going to flow into that inferior vena cava right here at the top. And so I don't think, and this is your gallbladder over here, this little greenish one that looks like a little balloon. And so that's a kind of a accessory organ that's linked and functions in conjunction with the liver. We'll talk about that next week a little bit.
So, Craig, does the hepatic vein split to 3 different veins, like all the way? And yeah, there is that.
Yeah, yeah. We've got 2 different lobes to the. Well, we've got a few different lobes. We've got kind of 2 primary lobes, and so each of those would be flowing through one lobe or the other lobe, essentially, when it splits. And again, that blood's coming up in. It's going to go through either this bigger right lobe or into the smaller left lobe of that liver, so that they can do their thing and process and modify whatever is in that blood, change the molecular shape. If we need to, if we have a lot of blood sugar in there, that liver can store some of that glycogen, store some of that glucose as glycogen, so that if we're fasted later and we need to raise our blood sugar, we can release it from the liver. We'll talk about that next week a little bit too. All right. I think that's probably really all we need to go through. Maybe we'll look at this one here, since it's a little bit more confusing on the veins than the arteries. Look at the key at the bottom. We've got our superficial veins. Those are the ones that I'll be more likely to ask you about than some of the deeper ones, with the exception maybe kind of up here close to the top. So we're going to have our same kind of names, and I'll just run through these real quick. We've got our subclavian vein. It's going to pass, well, it's flowing this way again. I guess we'll start distal and work our way up. So on the superficial side, on the thumb side, just like we had a radial artery, we're going to have a radial vein. Same thing on the pinky side, we're going to have an ulnar vein. So these lighter purple colors are ulnar veins and ulnar arteries. When we get up close to the elbow, they kind of start blending and mixing a little bit. And so this particular little section right here is usually referred to as the medial cubital vein. And so that's the one that usually is what you get stuck when you're donating blood or they're trying to draw a blood sample. That's kind of the most common one that they stick. Sometimes they'll stick this other branch that's more lateral. And that is our cephalic vein coming up laterally, going up towards the head. As that medial cubital vein kind of comes across to that medial side of the upper arm, right above the elbow, the contributions from the ulnar vein and the radial vein are also going to be carried up this branch, and that's our basilic vein. I'm not really sure where that name comes from necessarily, but it is. And then this part here, the darker one that's deeper, that's our brachial. So that's our brachial vein. So ultimately the basilic vein is going to merge into the brachial vein. The cephalic vein closer up towards the shoulder is going to merge. And then probably in this section, it probably changes its name to axillary vein. So the brachial vein would be these deeper, darker ones. And I think that's probably the extent of what you need to know for those. The leg is.
Sorry, Craig. So the brachial is more lateral. Is that what it?
So the most lateral, this lighter one is the cephalic one, and the lighter one that's the most medial is the basilic. This darker section that's deeper, it would be the brachial. And I'm not sure if this is like a right and left brachial. I'd have to review it, but I'll give you a hint. There's no questions about these two branches. I'll ask you more about the superficial ones than the deeper ones. So leg-wise, it's pretty much all the same as what we looked at the arteries. You're going to have the tibial veins, a fibular vein, femoral, popliteal vein, femoral vein, and then we get up into the iliac veins as well with that. So try not to overthink it and as you're studying these. And I think unless it's the ones that the companion vessels don't have the same names, if you're not sure, really just look at where it's located, which bone is it closest to, which body region is it located in, is it axillary, is it iliac, is it abdominal, and a lot of times you can just kind of problem solve which vessel it is by just kind of thinking through some of those common features and recognizing some of the underlying structures that these vessels are kind of hanging up on top of. There aren't any quiz questions about the lymphatic vessels that we covered today. The next written exam will probably ask some about really the primary ones, the lymphatic ducts, the cisterna chylae, the right thoracic duct, those type of things. But for this quiz that we've got on Tuesday, it's strictly just arteries and veins. And like I said, the only ones that on a given image you would need to know specifically, is it arterial system or venous system, would be the ones closest to the heart. The pulmonary trunk versus the aorta, know the different components of the aorta, know what a pulmonary artery is versus a pulmonary vein, and know those branches that are coming off of that aorta, that brachiocephalic on the right side that's going to split to the subclavian and the common carotid. On the left side, we've got both the left common carotid and the left subclavian splitting off of that. But
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
How can you tell an artery from a vein in a cadaver? Is there a trick?
Well, the texture is very, very different. Because if you remember when we looked at the walls, they both have the 3 layers, but that artery has a much thicker muscular layer. So on a cadaver, when there's not blood flowing through those spaces, the veins are really flat and collapsed because there's nothing to fill that space and make them kind of full. But the arteries, because it has a much more organized muscular structure, stay a lot rounder, and they're a lot firmer. So
Okay.
you can definitely feel the difference and look at them and you can see the difference on them. But the veins will typically be really thin-walled and very pliable and
So the veins deflate, but the arteries keep their shape.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, the arteries, you can squeeze them and they'll kind of bounce back up even on a dead cadaver. But the veins, they're literally just like 2 layers that are flattened down. They're no longer round looking because there's nothing in that space with the cadaver. So it's really super easy to tell the difference on a cadaver. So. All right. Well, I'm going to let you guys go. Like I said, I need to get in. I'm supposed to meet up with the second years to help them practice some skills because they've got their lab practicals coming up in a week or 2. But just study that information up. And next week, we're going to start in on I think we could do the pulmonary system probably on Tuesday. And then we'll do the digestive system on Thursday. I believe that's the order. And then we'll have our next test. And then we'll come back and we'll finish up the last 2 systems, which is basically the reproductive and the urinary system. We're not going to stress a ton on those 2 systems because we don't do nearly as much with them. But the lungs are really pretty important. And as far as the digestive system, it's mostly just kind of understanding what the role of those different organs are. We're not going to go deep into the physiology of how they all work. It's mostly just kind of knowing their location and knowing their general purpose that help us digest food. So we won't go super deep on those upcoming topics because we don't have that many more days left. So, all right. Any other questions before we let you guys leave, or let me leave? I can leave the Zoom open if you guys want to just hang out. Probably not. All right. Let me know as you're studying if you have other questions. Just shoot me a message and I'll get back to you. Otherwise, I'll see everybody on Tuesday.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day.